special edition of COS Live. I am Rita Peters. I'm very excited to be with you today. I am the Senior Vice President for Legislative Affairs with the Convention of States Project. And we're here with this special edition this morning because in just a few moments, there will be a hearing in the South Carolina Constitutional Law Subcommittee of the House Judiciary Committee. And President and co-founder of Convention of States Action, Mark Meckler, is there on the ground and he is expected to testify. So this is a big moment for Convention of States and we're excited to see what will happen. Now, 15 states have already passed our Article 5 resolution calling for a convention to propose constitutional amendments on 3 topics: imposing fiscal restraints on the federal government, limiting the power and jurisdiction of the federal government, and setting term limits for federal officials. Our resolution is currently being considered by an additional 20 states, including the great state of South Carolina. This graphic shows you where we have already passed the Convention of States resolution, where we currently have active legislation, and where we've passed in one chamber or the other. So you can see this is not just a pipe dream. The grassroots army that makes up Convention of States is busy making this happen. Now, State Representative Bill Taylor of Aiken, South Carolina, is our lead legislative sponsor in South Carolina. Here is a picture of him with the late Tom Coburn. In 2018, he was awarded our Abraham Lincoln Award for leadership toward a more perfect union. And that award was bestowed to him, as you see here, by our beloved Senator Tom Coburn. Now, this is something that the people are really agreed upon, that they want their state legislatures to pass this resolution for an Article 5 convention to rein in our runaway federal government. In fact, a poll recently revealed that 2/3 of South Carolina voters across party lines are in favor of an Article 5 convention of the states for this purpose. South Carolina voters are not happy with the federal government. They disapprove of the job that Congress has been doing by 83%. Congress only has a 10% approval rating. By a nearly 3-to-1 margin, South Carolina voters want to limit federal spending, which our resolution would allow for the states to impose if we get the 34 states we need, when we get the 34 states we need. And nearly 80% of South Carolina voters favor term limits for the U.S. Congress and for federal judges, also allowed under our Convention of States resolution. I should mention, too, that the South Carolina Convention of States grassroots army is one of the strongest in the nation. This team of volunteers was the 2020 Team of the Year, and for good reason. Here's a picture of some of the leaders of this great team. They earned the official support of both the Republican Party of South Carolina and the Libertarian Party of South Carolina. That took a lot of work. They have also recruited several high-profile endorsers who represent South Carolina in Washington, D.C., including Congressman Jeff Duncan, Congressman Ralph Norman, and Congressman William Timmons. Former U.S. Senator Jim DeMint of South Carolina is also a major endorser of the Convention of States project. The South Carolina team has sent hundreds of letters from citizen volunteers to their legislators. Those handwritten letters are so impactful. And they have an impressive list of legislative co-sponsors, at least 47. I think actually we're up in the 50s now of co-sponsors on the House side and 20 some on the Senate side. That is impressive and has represented the faithful and consistent outreach of the citizens of South Carolina who want to make this a reality. Last year, COS South Carolina made unprecedented progress in their state. Supporters packed the House committee hearings and presented their concerns through public testimony, similar to what you're going to see here in a few minutes. They even achieved passage in the House Judiciary Committee in 2020. That's the same committee we're in right now and whose subcommittee will be conducting the hearing in just a few minutes. For the first time ever in 2020, our resolution was placed on the list for debate in the South Carolina House on the floor, but unfortunately, COVID-19 really shut down the legislative session in South Carolina, as it did in so many other states across the country. So now they're back at it in 2021 with high hopes and serious resolve. So if we're successful today in the subcommittee, the next step would be a vote by the full House Judiciary Committee, which again, we did pass last year. We're getting reports right now that there is an overflow hearing room packed with Convention of State supporters in the South Carolina Legislative Building at the Capitol. And I want to remind you to stay tuned after the debate because we will have a recap here with live reaction, a fact check of the testimony that you'll hear and in the debate, as well as any remarks made by legislators. And we'll have an exclusive interview with Convention of States President and co-founder Mark Meckler, who again is live there on the scene and will be testifying in just a few moments. So we are going to transition to the hearing as soon as they get started there. Sometimes they're running a little bit late. Sometimes they have issues because we have so many supporters, so many citizen activists who show up for these hearings that sometimes they have to fill overflow rooms. They have to figure out what to do with all of the citizens who come out to support the Convention of States application. Now, I mentioned, I think 20 states, it's actually 22 states at the moment that have Convention of States resolutions pending in their state legislatures. And I'm going to just list them off for you. Listen to this list. It's quite diverse and impressive. Hawaii, Illinois, Iowa, Kentucky, Maine, Maryland, Massachusetts, Minnesota, Montana, Nebraska, New Hampshire, New Jersey, North Carolina, South Dakota, Vermont, Virginia, Washington, West Virginia, Wisconsin, and Wyoming. 15 states, as I mentioned, and you can see on this graphic, have already passed the resolution. Those are Georgia, Alaska, Alabama, Florida, Indiana, Oklahoma, Louisiana, Tennessee, North Dakota, Arizona, Missouri, Texas, Arkansas, Mississippi, and Utah. Those 15 states have already passed the resolution. They are waiting for their sister states around the country to step up and use their constitutional authority under Article 5 to bring about this Convention of the States for proposing amendments that will rein in federal power. I should mention that last Monday, the Missouri House General Laws Committee passed a resolution that would remove a sunset clause on their COS resolution. Although Missouri was the 12th state to have passed our Article 5 resolution, that legislation expires next year, and the legislatures are allowed to put sunset clauses on their resolutions. They are allowed to later retract their resolutions if they so choose. But in Missouri, the vote to remove the sunset provision so that the resolution will stay live and active, it was an overwhelmingly positive vote, 11-4. So if passed through both chambers, Missouri will continue to count toward the 34 states needed to call the convention. So onward, Missouri, let's do it, move forward. On Wednesday, we passed in the Wisconsin Assembly Committee on Constitution and Ethics. That was last Wednesday. It was a vote of 5-4. And we're looking for an assembly floor vote now as early as next week. So we are eager to add Wisconsin. And I really think we're going to have a showdown here for which state is going to be number 16. Will it be South Carolina? Will it be Wisconsin? I even hear West Virginia is in the mix there. So stay tuned to see which state will be number 16, which state is the next to step up and use its constitutional authority to rein in our runaway federal government. Our resolution, as I mentioned, has been introduced in the West Virginia House. It has bipartisan support. We are a nonpartisan organization, and we, regularly have bipartisan support, even, bipartisan co-sponsorship and sponsorship in some cases, because every American should be able to agree that under our Constitution, it was never meant to be Washington, D.C. setting the policy for all 50 states. The vast majority of the policy that governs our daily lives was always meant to come from the state level, not from a distant, out-of-touch capital in Washington. So no matter which party you're from, hopefully you can agree with that. And it looks like the subcommittee hearing is getting started, so we're going to transition you now, and hope you enjoy this subcommittee hearing. Stay tuned.
Signed up to speak this morning, both in person and virtually. The format, we're going to hear from the people that are here in this room with us, then switch to the virtual at the time that we move those that are in room 511 here to be able to speak to us briefly. The bill as introduced would serve as South Carolina's continuing application to Congress for an amendment Convention of the States pursuant to Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution. The bill lists 3 limits to the convention to proposing amendments to the United States Constitution that impose fiscal restraints on the federal government, limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government, and limit the terms of office for its officials and for members of Congress. I am going to ask, because of the number of folks that we have signed up to speak, that you kind of try to keep your comments brief this morning. We don't want to cut anybody off, but we also want to make sure that we have time to hear from all those that have signed up to speak. With that, we have the bill sponsor with us here today, Representative Bill Taylor. Mr. Taylor, we'll start with you, and appreciate you being here this morning. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Are we on here? Make sure. Okay. Thank you. And thank you all. Appreciate being here, but I appreciate you being here. This is not a great weather day, so it's nice that you could make the special effort to be here. Well, I've stood at this podium many times about this various bill. It was first filed in 2013, December 3rd, 2013. It's a long time ago. We were the first state to file this piece of legislation. And since then, 15 states have passed it. We have not, but hopefully we will. The issue is simple. Washington is broken, completely dysfunctional. You only have to look at this morning's news or yesterday's news or tomorrow's news to know that it's out of whack completely. Americans have now, look at any survey, have lost confidence in their government. That is not a good thing. It can be fixed, but only you have the power to fix it. I look at you and say, you are, and you'll think I'm overstating this, hyperbole, not. You are the most important elected officials in America. By the way, that's what our founders intended, federalism. You know, federalism. The states are in control. The federal government was there to protect us from foreign powers and all of that. Well, in the last certainly 150 years, that's gotten completely out of whack. We now have a mega federal government, command and control, stepping over us, ignoring anything the states wants. Folks, we can cure this. It's the only cure that the founders gave us. They knew at the very last when they inserted this Article 5 in the Constitution, that cherished document, that states need to be able to propose amendments to the Constitution. Didn't say we're going to rip the Constitution up. We're not going to have a runaway convention, or like the opponents said, silly, their marketing thing is a con. We're not going to have that. I said the jump bar for changing the Constitution by adding amendments to it is very high and very difficult. They couldn't even pass the ERA around the states and get it done. Come on. So what we have now is not the potential of deciding on a runaway convention of states. We have a runaway Congress. Think about that. They are, the con is under the dome of the US Capitol right now. They propose somewhere between 75, 80 or more amendments to the Constitution every session. Fortunately, there isn't even enough wisdom up there. They can't get the needed votes to get those out to the states. But even if they did, and this convention of states, when it comes together with each state having one vote, the possibility of getting an amendment limiting the federal government is still very high. 3/4 of the states have to pass it. And not only that, both the House and the Senate in each of those. So it only takes one body in there not to stop it, okay? So nonsense is not going to happen. But we do need to take control. And you have the power to do that. Pass this bill today to full judiciary. And full judiciary then can look at this bill and hopefully get it to us on the House floor. This is the only fix. Our founders are speaking to us from their graves. They left us a message in Article 5. Fix an overbloated, out of control federal government. Thanks for your consideration.
Thank you, Representative Taylor. Mark Meckler, and second will be Lynn Teague. Good morning, sir, and welcome.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, honorable members of the committee. It is truly an honor to be here today. I appreciate in the face of this weather event that you guys actually showed up here to do the people's business. I have the honor of representing over 5 million people nationally. I'm the president of Convention of States Action. We are the national organization pushing forward for an Article 5 convention among the states. We have a fundamental problem in Washington, D.C., which is Washington, D.C. has grown out of control. I think Representative Taylor described it well, but I want to show you a visual representation. When we talk about the United States Constitution, we are generally talking about this document. Many of you have one of these. It's called a pocket constitution, this particular one from the Heritage Foundation. And I hear from our opponents all the time that this is just a wonderful, perfect document and we ought not to, quote unquote, mess with it. And I would agree with them on that. Unfortunately, today, if you call the government publishing office and say you'd like to order the United States Constitution, you'll be stunned because they'll ask you for $130+. Not because this one's printed on gold leaf, but because they are talking about this Constitution. And if you read the spine, I'm not overstating it. It says the Constitution of the United States of America, Centennial Edition. 2,738 pages. This one's published in 2012. It's the last full edition. If you have all the supplements, I don't travel with those. It's over 3,000 pages and over 10 pounds. This contains every case ever issued by the United States Supreme Court telling us what this document means. And they have changed the meaning of this document dramatically and fundamentally and in a way that most Americans don't agree with. 72% of Americans today say that the federal government is too big and does too much. You can imagine at 72%, that's bipartisan. 80 to 85% of Americans polled over the last 30 years consistently say we need term limits in Washington, D.C. 80 to 85% of Americans polled consistently over the last 30 years say we need a balanced budget imposed on Washington, D.C. The three subject matter areas of the resolution before you today allow all of those things to be imposed on Washington, D.C. Why do we need to impose those things? Doesn't Congress have the power to propose those amendments? Indeed, they do, and indeed, they never will. It's not human nature for people to limit their own power. No tyranny in human history has ever limited their own power. This idea, the idea that you, the state legislators, would have the power to do this was presented to the Constitutional Convention on September 15th, 1787. Colonel George Mason stood and he addressed the men assembled and he said this: we have a fundamental problem with the document we've drafted. By the way, this is only 2 days before the convention's over. They are done, essentially. The document is in final form. He says, we have a fundamental problem. We've given the power to Congress to propose amendments, but we've not given the power to the people acting through the states. And he asked a question to ask you today. And I would ask opponents of this resolution, are we so naive that we believe that a federal government that becomes a tyranny will ever propose the right kind of amendments to restrain that tyranny? Now, we know the founders' answers because it was very clear. Madison's notes reflect two Latin abbreviations at that moment in the convention, and they say nin com, which is short Latin for no comment, no debate. They didn't even debate it. It was so obvious to the men assembled. I think they probably laughed when he said it. They felt foolish that they had forgotten to include this. And we actually know that because a vote was taken, and they included the second clause of Article 5, what we're actually debating today, unanimously. It's the only thing I'm aware of in the Constitution, no debate and unanimously adopted. And they chose to give you the power. Representative Taylor discussed this. I think this is incredible. When you come here and you get your orientation and they show you where the restrooms are and the cafeteria is, where the legislative drafting office is, they don't tell you about your federal power. I've asked this question to state legislators all over the country, people whom I respect highly. What's your role in the federal government? And I usually get a blank stare. And the answer is, you are the most powerful people in the federal government. For only you have the power to call a convention, to propose amendments, and to ratify those amendments, thereby changing the actual structure of the federal government. Why you? Why didn't they give that power to Congress? Why didn't they give that power to the president or to the courts? Sometimes the courts take it without being given. Why'd they give it to you? And the answer is because they were you. You are them. They were state legislators. They were on county councils and county boards of supervisors. They understood and believed in government close to the people. What we're asking you to do today is to restore federalism, to take a stand that South Carolinians should decide for themselves. The fundamental question that you have to ask yourself when you vote on this is, who decides? Does Washington, D.C. decide for South Carolina? Do we believe that? Do we believe in the status quo? Do we believe that they should continue to control 60 to 65 South Carolinians who wish to decide for themselves? I have the honor standing here today of representing almost 40,000 South Carolinians who have signed the petition in support of Convention of States. And standing here speaking for them, I would ask you to pass this resolution out of subcommittee. I also have to let you know that today, sitting downstairs in the overflow rooms, over 60, when I was down there, over 60 people here in support, on a weather day like today, in support of Convention of States. An overwhelming number of people travel from all across the state to make their presence and their support known to you. So standing here today, it's my honor to represent those 40,000 South Carolinians, the South Carolinians who traveled here today, to ask you to pass this resolution out of subcommittee. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time today.
Thank you, Mr. Meckler. Questions or comments by members of the committee? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Lynn Teague and then Ronald Duffala. Okay.
Thank
Good
you
morning
very
and
much.
welcome.
Lynn Teague for the League of Women Voters of South Carolina. And I think most of you probably heard me speak against similar bills in the past, and I'm here to do it again. We accept the arguments of constitutional scholars who believe that these resolutions put our Constitution at grave risk, that the risks are graver than supporters would have us believe, and that a convention would allow for fundamentally altering our nation. The resolution is promoted by people who want the power to do as they please without federal intervention to protect our environment, consumers, employees, or the basic civil rights that our Constitution guarantees. And it gains support from people who believe that the resulting changes will only alter the things they don't like, and don't imagine that it would alter the things that they do rely on every day. Fiscal restraint doesn't just mean ending welfare, as some like to think. At the level sought by supporters of this resolution, we would see an end or severe cuts to agricultural subsidies, funds for dredging Charleston Harbor or renourishing beaches, and Social Security and Medicare. South Carolina receives far more money from the federal government than we send to Washington. It would be an economic crisis for the federal government to cut back. And reining in the federal government doesn't just mean an end to federal protection of social justice rights supported by progressives. It would put free speech and gun rights and religious liberty at risk. It would injure the orderly conduct of business between states and with other countries. It could expose us to uncontrolled release of toxins into air and water by those who value their profits above our lives. And it would permit the sale of vehicles or medicine or children's toys that are unsafe and endanger us and our families. Supporters of these resolutions argue that the need to submit amendments proposed by a convention for approval is adequate protection. We're not convinced. Amendments generated by a convention would be sold to public and to state legislators with vast amounts of dark money advertising and lobbying. The slogans to sell those amendments would be as seductive as those used to sell this dangerous resolution. The League of Women Voters of South Carolina ask you not to forward this with a favorable recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Teague. Questions or comments? Thank you very much. Ronald Duffala, good morning and welcome.
I don't usually speak to publicly, so I'm a little nervous. I'm here, though, defending our form of government, not to change it. I'm a Vietnam veteran. I wear this particular hat because I didn't belong to the 11th Cavalry, Armored Cavalry, but they saved my butt in Vietnam during the Tet Offensive. And I understand the term enemy within the wire. And I just want to ask you, do you understand what that means when you have enemies within the wire? We had our outlying units overrun, artillery units being overrun by the enemy. And the call was enemy within the wire. That means they're not only fighting hand-to-hand combat, they're putting on American uniforms. You don't know who they are. They're inside the wire. You don't know until they stab you in the back. And I'm afraid we have that going on in Washington. We have enemies inside the wire. I'm here as a third-generation American. My grandfather taught me about his love for this country. He left Slovakia, right next to the Ukraine. He came over as a teenager, and he put an American flag in his front yard, and it never came down except at dusk, and in the morning it went back up again. He did that his whole life. He taught me those values. He passed them on to my dad. He says, you're not going to speak Slovakian in my house. You're going to speak English. You're going to learn the American way. I've left the old behind. I'm here, an American. He taught me those values. Why did I go to Vietnam? I'll tell you. It was American family values taught to me by my grandfather about this country. And the other thing was what my grandfather was taught me about socialism, what he was running away from. I heard on the news at that time in Vietnam era, you'll remember, it's the domino effect. One country falls, the next will fall. If we don't hold Vietnam, South Vietnam, then it's going to be all Southeast Asia. And then it's going to be here. Well, I say it's here. We got enemies inside the wire. But our founding fathers made a way to defend us when it got out of control. And our plea is that you guys will do your job. The domino effect has happened all across this world. It's in Washington. Look around. We have enemies inside the wire. But they have a socialist agenda, one my grandfather talked to me about. Who pays for the votes? International corporations, chambers of commerce, globalists. It's not the American people. Has it been all the polls show what the American people believe. But we have enemies inside the wire. They're our leaders. And they're leading us in the wrong direction. I need to vote for the Constitution of States, Convention of States. I like to call it the Amendment of States, because it's our turn to put forth an amendment, not the people in Washington. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ruffalo. We're now going to, security's going to move the folks that are in 511 in here to social.
Not the American people. There's all the polls show what the American people believe.
Yes, sir, Mr. Bamberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To the gentleman just speaking, I just wanted to thank you for your service. My grandfather did 2 tours in Vietnam, and I just, on behalf of the committee, we all appreciate your service of the country.
May I make one more comment?
Yes, sir.
During the Tet Offensive, when these guys saved our butt, the guy who used to do shaving on our compound, shaving our neck, he was pulled off our wire, dead the next morning after that attack. You don't know who they are.
Thank you, sir. Robert Brown, then Sean Meacham on the virtually. Mr. Brown? Are you with us this morning?
Yes, can you hear me?
We can hear you. Good morning, and thank you for being here.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. So we're back again reviewing the Convention of States application yet again. It's notable that every legislature prior that has reviewed it has rejected it, and for good reason. In fact, it was just over a year ago that I was able to be there in person, and I followed Mr. Meckler as my testimony right after his. And in my testimony, I went through point by point everything he claimed and refuted it. I'm not going to spend as much time on that today, but I do want to make a few key points. In the opening testimony, it was pointed out that this is the only solution our founders gave us, and that's blatantly untrue. The founders went into great detail. If you are a fan of the Federalist Papers, for example, read through Federalist 16, 26, 33, 44, and especially 40. Every legislature prior has rejected it for good reason. The founders clearly told us what to do when the federal government oversteps their bounds. And that's what those Federalist Papers are devoted to. And guess what never comes up in those? Changing the Constitution. In fact, in Federalist 48 and 49, Madison addresses that question as well. Should we use the Article 5 process for reining in those who don't obey the Constitution? He clearly says no in Federalist 48 and 49. The founders told us what to do. And in fact, we, the people, and we, the states, already have the power to rein them in. I had an interesting conversation just over a year ago with the Lieutenant Governor of Arkansas. As a former congressman, his name is Tim Griffin. As a former congressman, he told me the most interesting thing he learned as being a member of Congress was that, to his surprise, Congress is actually very responsive to the will of their constituents, which he had never suspected. And he took as an example the balanced budget movement. He says, of course, the balanced budget movement has large popular support across the country, so why don't they pass a balanced budget? And his answer is, yes, the people want a balanced budget, but they don't want it more than they want their federal programs, their government handouts, and so on. He said the states are the same way. They don't want it more than they want their federal funding. The moment that changes, and that becomes top priority for the American people, then Congress will champion that cause, and not before. I ask you, would your own state right now entertain a motion to reject all federal funding in order to help balance the budget? So far, I haven't seen any support for that type of an effort in any state, because we, the people, and we, the states, are not desiring a balanced budget more than all the other things the federal government does for us. There are a number of things that are promoted regarding the Article 5 Convention that are blatantly false. One of which is history. I'm going to just briefly mention, last time I was there, I went into much more detail on this. I'll send an email with more detail as well, because I feel like evidence and references are essential very well right now. But in 1787, the precedent set by that convention was the precedent of a runaway convention. And as proof of that, all you have to do is look to Madison's notes from the 1787 convention, because it repeatedly came up in that convention. Do we actually have the authority to be proposing these massive sweeping changes to create an entirely new constitution? And the answer repeatedly came back as one of two. There were those who said, we don't have this power and we should not proceed until we get the authority from our states. And the other answer that came back was, you're right, we probably don't have the authority, but it is essential that we proceed anyway. Not a single delegate in the 1787 convention made the claim that Mark Meckler frequently makes, or they have full authority to make any changes they felt necessary. No one believed that. Not a single delegate. They moved forward knowing full well they were acting beyond the scope of power that they were given by their states. This is essential because this is the only precedent we have for a national constitution amending convention, the 1787 convention. They instead said they're going to appeal to the power of the people, as citing the Declaration of Independence, to alter or abolish their government. And that they weren't acting, in fact, I'm going to share one quote with you. In the ratifying convention in Pennsylvania after the Constitution was created, James Wilson addressed this charge. Wasn't this convention overstepping their bounds? And he agreed they did. In fact, what he said was the federal convention did not act at all upon the powers given to them by the states. They proceeded on original principles, having framed a constitution which they thought would promote the happiness of their country. And they've submitted it for their consideration, which may adopt or reject it as they please. There's more than a dozen different citations from founders on both sides of this argument, all of whom claimed, yes, the Federal Convention of 1787 overstepped their bounds. That's the only precedent we have. And interestingly, in the state conventions for amending their constitution ever since, this issue has repeatedly come up as well. Can the state legislature restrain the convention for proposing amendments to our state constitution?
Mr. Brown, let me check. That was the buzzer that went off for 5 minutes, which was the limit we were trying to hold. Let me, if I may, you know, you made reference to sending some written materials in, and I would appreciate if you do that to the committee. But we do want to make sure we have the opportunity to hear everybody that has signed up or has come here today. Quickly, questions by members of the committee? Mr. Brown, thank you very much. We appreciate you being with us here this morning.
Thank you.
Next is Sean is that Meacham? Meehan. Good morning and welcome. We're ready to hear from you. Mr. Meehan, can you unmute?
While he's working that out, you have Evan Mulch is sitting here.
Okay. Mr. Meehan, can you hear me? If you can, nod your head.
Thank you.
Next is Sean Meehan. Good morning and welcome.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me? I'm having some trouble, it looks like, on my end.
It sounds like you're hearing it on the stream on ETV as well as on your
computer. Can you hear me, sir?
I can hear you. We look forward to hearing from you.
I believe I am unmuted. Yes, sir, I can hear you. I can hear you. Can you hear me? Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me? I'm having some trouble, it looks like, on my end.
It sounds like you're hearing it on the stream on ETV as well as on your
computer. Can you hear me, sir?
I can hear you. We look forward to hearing from you.
All right, Mr. Chairman, seeing that we're having some difficulties, I'll just say a few quick things, and hopefully it will go with that. I will say, much like Mr. Meckler said, some false things. Robert Brown is absolutely correct. George Mason did stand up September 15th and say that no amendments of the proper kind would ever be obtained if the government became oppressive. But it's important to understand what that means, Mr. Chairman, because Colonel Mason also said at the beginning of the 1787 convention on June 11th that amendments would address defects as the document certainly would have. And it's important that amendments correct defects. Amendments have nothing to do with making the government obey the Constitution. It just makes absolutely no sense. The quote is that the Constitution now being formed will certainly be defective as the Articles of Confederation have been found to be. Amendments therefore will be necessary, and it will be better to provide for them in an easy, regular, and constitutional way than to trust to chance and violence. It would be improper to require the consent of the national legislature because they may abuse their power and refuse their consent. And I'll end simply, Mr. Chairman, by saying I'll forward some support information. You've got it last year from Mr. Brown. And I'll end with this quote. And this is very important to me because when the Convention of States held their simulated convention to persuade people with a theatrical production that a convention would not be a problem, they reversed the meaning of a quote from Thomas Jefferson, and it's offensive to people that love integrity and the truth in our Constitution. I started my Air Force service flying career at Charleston Air Force Base in the early 90s in your beautiful state of South Carolina that has an incredible history with states' rights, and that's really what we're talking about this morning. The quote is from Thomas Jefferson to Archibald Stewart, December 23rd, 1791. And the quote is this: "Then it is important to strengthen the state governments, and this cannot be done by any change in the federal Constitution. For the preservation of that is all we need contend for. It must be done by the states themselves, erecting such barriers at the constitutional line as cannot be surmounted either by themselves or by the general government. The only barrier in their government, the only barrier in their power is a wise government." Mr. Chairman, that's what your committee is doing today. You're seeking evidence and proof from both sides to become a more wiser government. God bless you for that. Mr. Meckler is correct. That is your role, to become wise and represent your people. Please do not believe Mr. Meckler and anything he says. Please do not believe me and anything I say. Do not believe any other witnesses. Please have your contemporaries and your staff investigate the facts for yourself. Thank you for serving. Thank you for pledging an oath to the Constitution. And may God bless your adventures here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Meehan. We appreciate you being with us here this morning and offering testimony. Next, we're going to move to Evan Mulch. And then following Mr. Mulch, we have Sherry Irvin. For the info for those on the committee, everybody who was on the in the portal and waiting room to be heard from virtually, we have completed that testimony. And now our testimony going forward is exclusively those folks that are here in person with us today. Mr. Mulch, good morning. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. I'm from Spartanburg, South Carolina. I did hand out a Freedom Index. I know the man over here is going to get it around here. I do have some great news. So some of us have been informing congressmen that they're not obeying the Constitution. And so we do have one person who scored a 100% on the New American Freedom Index, this last Freedom Index. This is the ultimate scorekeeper for whether or not a congressman obeys the U.S. Constitution. And Congressman Ralph Norman scored a 100 100%. And this work on behalf of citizens of, because we informed him a couple years ago in the last few, months prior that he wasn't obeying the Constitution completely. And this is important because there's no need to call it a Constitutional Convention or Convention of States, whatever you want to call it, if our congressmen don't currently obey the Constitution. As you can see, looking through the Freedom Index, they don't do a very good job at all for the most part. Lindsey Graham has scored an average of 13% according to the Constitution. And most of us probably voted for him in the last election. I think those seated in the overflow crowds too probably voted for Lindsey Graham. So we're electing people that don't obey the U.S. Constitution. So that's a big problem. So what point is it to amend the Constitution if they don't obey the Constitution currently? The key is state nullification. The key is anti-commandeering at the state level. The guys over here got it right. The key is the state people. You're the most important people, but you have to do your part in nullifying unconstitutional federal laws. And that's how we're going to get our states moving again without this federal government overreach. So I did hand out a document about Mark Levin's risky solution. Mark Levin does not support nullification, never has. He's very outspoken against it. A lot of us here, I think a few representatives here actually support state nullification. So we got to get back to adhering to the Constitution. It takes citizens all around the state using this Freedom Index and actually teaching the Constitution in their districts to get our Congress back on track. And we did it with Ralph Norman. I'm so proud of him. And many others are doing a little bit better. So anyways, that's why I wanted to say, a lot of people here that are supportive of Convention of States, they don't realize that the left wants a con too. If you look at the fact that Sink Uger from Wolfpack, he actually wants to have a Constitutional Convention as well. That's important to know because what is the negotiation that's going to take place if that happens? Not many people know too that Mark Meckler offered Rush Limbaugh over $2 million to puff up the Convention of States project. Rush Limbaugh did us a favor and he never did that. He did not take the $2 million. This is actually on video. I've got it on my YouTube page. So if you go to Evan Mulch, you can see that Rush Limbaugh declined the $2 million. So that says a lot that Mark Meckler is able to go around places and offer people millions of dollars to support this call for convention. So you have to wonder where the dark money's coming from. And I hope Mark will understand that the American people do not want this. Rush Limbaugh did not want it, and Donald Trump has never advocated for this either. So I just want everybody to take note of that.
Thank you, Mr. Mulch. Questions or comments by members of the committee? Thank you very much for being here. We appreciate your time this morning. Sherry Irwin and then Patrick Davidson. Good morning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do ask a favor, two favors. One, we could pass this around. This is from Joanna Martin, a brilliant constitutional scholar that spoke last year. So I want to make sure that you guys all get this. And I do ask a favor too, since I got up at 5 this morning and drove here, if you would put your phones down and listen to what I have to say, because this is kind of really important. I appreciate it. I am opposed to a constitutional convention, Article 5 convention or convention of states, whatever they want to call it. It's a distinction without a difference. There are two ways to, in Article 5, to propose amendments the way we've always done it. In Congress, it goes out to the states. You guys have the power to decide whether it passes or not. The one we have not done since our original convention was call for a constitutional convention. Article 5 says Congress may decide on the mode of ratification, which means Congress has the power, not you. They actually, in April of 2014, did a report of the Congressional Research Service, and it states that Congress understands that Article 5 grants to Congress exclusive authority to set up a convention. Congress, it says so in Article 5. The report exposes a false convention of state assurances that the states would be in control of the convention. They will not be. Second, while the Constitution is silent on the mechanics of an Article 5 convention, Congress has traditionally laid claim to broad responsibilities in connection with the convention, including receiving, judging, and recording state applications, establishing procedures to summon a convention, and here's the kicker, determining the number of delegates and the selection process for the delegates. Folks, that means they're telling you one per state. No, Congress will decide how many per state. It goes on to say Congress can appoint themselves as a delegate. Did you know that? Imagine Congress, those guys up there, some of those guys appointing themselves as delegates. You will not have any say. tonight, please sit down and really read Article 5 and ask yourself, where does it say we have the power? It does not. Madison was one of the ones who threw out the Articles of Confederation. But he also said in Federal 49 that a convention is not how you rein in the federal government, it's how you throw out a constitution, because the people do have a right in convention to throw out a constitution and start over. If we had a socialist constitution, it'd be great to call a convention, but we don't. We have a beautiful constitution. So here's a real kicker. This is the million-dollar question. Why on earth did they put it in there? Here's why they put it in there. Sorry, wrong page. The big question was, why did they put this convention method in Article 5? Because the anti-federalists at the convention wanted another convention so they could get rid of the Constitution that they had just drafted, our current one. Again, the anti-federalists wanted it put in there so they could another convention to throw out our Constitution. That's why it was put in there. It's in line with the Declaration of Independence, which states we have a right to throw off a tyrannical government. We will not get a better Constitution than what we have. We need you guys to step it up, stop unconstitutional law, stop unconstitutional executive orders. The president can't sign executive orders letting a men come into my bathroom or into my dressing room, or to take spots away from girls in sports so they no longer can get a scholarship to college. Women are losing their rights. We need you guys to step it up and just say no. You don't even have to pass a law. You tell Congress, we will not enforce that in the state of South Carolina. It's called nullification. It is not on the list of the federal things that they are allowed to do, and you tell them to go pound sand and let them know we have a lot of sand here in South Carolina. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Irwin. Questions by members of the committee? Thank you very much. Patrick Davidson, David Lewis, and Hilda Lewis will wrap up having previously folks that were in the waiting room for teams all been addressed. There seems to be some folks coming in late. If you hadn't heard me at that time, we've moved from the virtual setting now to the in-person setting, and brought forward testimony from everybody who was in teams at the point in time that we were moving that forward. So, Mr. Davidson, thank you for being here this morning. We look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much for allowing me to share how important a convention of the states is to me, my fellow volunteers, and the tens of thousands of South Carolinians that support the process. It is my belief that the federal government is never going to relinquish its own power without that power that is legally granted them by the Constitution, or whether they have seized it from the states or one branch from the other. Our current system of allowing congressmen and women to stay in Congress for life after continuously being reelected, and to allow limitless campaign financing from jurisdictions unrelated to the office has created a complete power grab by the elected, by the federal government as a whole, by the richest people, companies, and countries in the world. Often citizens are afraid to primary a sitting U.S. congressperson, even though they may not agree with a lot of what they say, due to the seniority of that congressperson. Political lobbying alone is a multi-billion-dollar business. I don't think that's what's right for American citizens. I don't think that's the way it was meant to be. And I don't think we're going to make any progress on any of those things I just mentioned without a convention of the states. I've appreciated some of the concerns of legislators, primarily being, what if we have a runaway election? Allow me to share a quote from Article 5 of the Constitution. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a constitutional expert, but I can read. The Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses shall deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to this Constitution or on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states, shall call a convention for proposing amendments, which in either case shall be valid to all intents and purposes as part of the Constitution when ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of the several states. I trust that 3/4 of our state houses across America will not ratify anything outlandish. And if so, another convention could clarify their language if there was gray areas. I am fearful that some other things will happen. I'm not fearful about a runaway convention at all, because of what I just mentioned. I am fearful that our country is spending itself into decrease. I am fearful that politicians spend their way to re-election with the purse of American taxpayers. I am concerned that no American citizen can name every federal agency due to its massive numbers. These agencies impose rules and fines not voted on by the U.S. Congress. I am fearful that the United States Congress has been combining federal grants with federal mandates to control the South Carolina legislature and others. We are being bribed with our own taxpayer funds to fall in line or else. I am fearful that the federal government has been operating outside the few and defined powers specifically granted by the Constitution, while state powers that were left broad and undefined have diminished dramatically. Our state representatives know what the people of South Carolina want and need.
Mr. Davidson, I need you to wrap up your testimony. That was a 5-minute buzzer, please.
Yes, sir. Thanks for hearing my speeches. There's millions of Americans that support this. It's very clear in the Constitution that this was a tool that exists just for such a day. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Questions or comments by members of the committee?
I would just, Mr. Chairman, I would just thank Mr. Davidson for coming in. I've known Pat for 45 plus years, so it's always good to see a fellow Somerville Green Wave up at the State House. So thank you, Pat, for coming up.
Next, David Lewis, and then Hilda Lewis. Mr. Lewis here. It's David Lewis and Hilda Lewis. We're going to see if they're in the room next door.
You're in there. It explains why they put it in there.
Room that weren't there when we concluded the virtual the session. We're going to try to get to them briefly while we're waiting on the folks to come upstairs from the downstairs room. As you all know, we have an end time period of 10 o'clock. We're going to hear from those 4 people, and that's it. I do have obtained the permission for from the speaker for us to get through the testimony today and allow us the opportunity to debate this bill. But we're not going to allow we've already closed the virtual setting. We're going to open it. These 2 people had signed up, but it appears as people drop off and come back on that, we do have to have some parameters. So quickly, what?
Judy Caller?
Judy, what's her last name?
Caller?
Holler.
Caller?
Judy Caller, C-A-L-L-E-R. Are you there? Ms. Caller? Judy, are you with us this morning? Who's next?
Joanne Martin?
All right. And then Joanne Martin, are you with us, Ms. Martin?
Yeah.
Mr. Lewis, we'll be with you in just 1 minute. We're just trying to maximize our time. Joanna Martin? All right.
Joanna Martin is here.
Okay, Ms. Martin, we'd love to hear from you. We are compressed for time. I would ask you to try to keep your comments to between 2 and 3 minutes. Thank you, ma'am.
Okay. Oh. Okay, am I on?
Yes, ma'am, you are on. If you're listening to it
Okay.
streaming on ETV, you're delayed.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chairman, honorable members, I'm Joanna Martin and speak as a citizen against H 3205. COS claims our framers gave us the convention method so we could get amendments to rein in the federal government when it gets out of control. Our framers did not say that, and COS can't produce a quote. First, our Constitution already limits the federal government to a handful of enumerated powers. Everyone ignores the existing constitutional limits. Appendix A to my written testimony quotes from Madison's Journal of the Federal Convention of 1787 and proves what Mr. Meacham said. The framers said the purpose of amendments is to remedy defects in the Constitution. Appendix A also proves the framers recognize that the purpose of a convention is to get another constitution. On August the 31st, 1787, George Mason said he'd rather chop off his right hand than put it to the Constitution as it now stands. And if it weren't changed, he wanted another convention. And Madison warned, see footnote 2, that people seeking to get rid of our Constitution would use getting amendments as a pretext for getting another convention where they could get rid of our Constitution. That's what's going on today. New constitutions are already out there. See the links in the appendix, read them and tremble. Next, COS says state legislators select the delegates, control them, recall them if they disobey. Where does the Constitution say that? It doesn't. COS made it up. My appendix B quotes the Constitution. Article 5 says Congress calls the convention. Article 1, Section 8 class law gives Congress the power to make the laws necessary and proper to carry out its power to call the convention. The CRS report shows that Congress understands that it has the power to determine the number and selection process for delegates. So Congress does have the authority to select the delegates. They can select themselves. This is why Madison, Hamilton, 4 U.S. Supreme Court justices, and other legal scholars warn against a convention.
Ms. Martin, I appreciate your, that was the buzzer that went off. As I mentioned to you, our virtual time allotment for this meeting had already expired, but we were going back and trying to get those that we called on. But we do have a deadline, and as I mentioned, I'm trying to make sure we hear from as many people as possible. Appreciate the fact that you have submitted the written testimony as well, and thank you for being here with us this morning. Quickly, questions by members of the subcommittee for Ms. Martin. Ms. Martin, thank you again for being with us this morning. Mr. Lewis, I think that security has now brought you up in here into the hearing room. David Lewis. Thank you, Ms. Martin. Mr. Lewis, good morning and welcome.
Thank you, sir. I was going to yield my time to this gentleman, but I just wanted to speak for 1 second to say that I am in support of the Articles of Convention of the States, and I appeal to this legislature to support that. I know that it's a hard thing to do to think about amending the Constitution, but I am also a retired military. My son is retired military. My dad retired from the military. I've got 2 grandkids in the Army, and I cherish their time and what they're doing. And I just ask that this legislature support this article because our government has gotten way out of control. And the only way to bring it back, contrary to what some people have said, is the Article 5 is my belief. I just thank you, and I yield my other time.
Thank you, Mr. Lewis. Unfortunately, you can't yield your time. I appreciate you doing that. Sir, I apologize. You're not signed up on.
Third time I've been to one of these meetings.
Yes, sir. And I apologize. Unfortunately, you're not signed up on any of the list, and I've already close that list, but do appreciate you being here. Hilda Lewis. Okay. Both of you all had signed up to speak meeting. I apologize, sir. We just can't let you yield the time and expand the list. We have we monitor the list pretty closely so that we make sure we hear from everybody that has signed up when we start the hearings. But do appreciate so much you being here, and thank you for your testimony. Members of the committee, that is all of the testimony that we have that has signed up based on the parameters of this meeting being held both in person and virtually. The matter before us today is H 3205. Much of the testimony we've heard today has also been supplemented by the various emails and material that we have received in the both in the mail and email, and have heard previously. Questions or comments by members of the subcommittee? Otherwise, we'll move to a vote. Mr. Bamberg, do I see that you have questions, comments? Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I will go as quick as I possibly can. I know the testimony ran a little bit today. I think that we've got to keep in mind here, and I understand the issues of, is the federal government growing, ballooning out of control? We live in a state that heavily relies on federal funding. At one point, the state of South Carolina was in the top 10 of states dependent on federal funding. And at that point, I believe out of all of the top 10, 9 of them were Republican controlled, with the exception of New Mexico, which was democratically controlled. But even if you fast forward to recently, so 2020, federal money accounted for 31.9% of the state of South Carolina's general fund. That would have put us at the 30th most dependent on federal funding. So while we also look at the expansion of federal powers, we have to keep in mind that we live in a state that if we were to lose 25% of the federal funding we get from the federal government, South Carolina's economy would collapse. And I think that is extremely important, even through COVID-19. Just in January, the governor was figuring out how to spend an additional $20 million to be used on COVID related education funding. September, we were up here as a body and voted on $693 million in federal funding. We voted to apportion to help our state get through something that we ourselves were not capable of doing financially. This bill is requesting that term limits be introduced in Congress. We don't have term limits in this state. I don't know anybody in the House or the Senate here who is in support of or has filed legislation to limit terms here. Me personally don't believe in term limits. I think that the people vote for who they want, and everybody has a chance. If they're tired of Lindsey Graham or Congressman Clyburn or anybody, they have the opportunity to vote and end their term. There was some mention in the testimony about the courts, the U.S. Supreme Court's interpretation of the Constitution, and the book was 200 some odd pages. I would just note for the committee that without the United States Supreme Court in those rulings, I wouldn't be here as a minority in this state. We wouldn't have Powell versus Alabama, which is the 1932 case that guaranteed the right to counsel in all state and federal courts. We wouldn't have Shelley v. Kramer, which was the 1948 case that said that courts in America cannot constitutionally enforce restrictive covenants that prohibited people of certain races from owning or occupying land. We wouldn't have had the Heartland of Atlanta Motel versus U.S. case that said that hotels could not discriminate against people. In particular to me, we wouldn't have had Loving versus Virginia, which was 1967, in which the United States Supreme Court said that states cannot constitutionally ban interracial marriage. And even the Loving versus Virginia case, 16, including South Carolina, still had an interracial marriage ban. We didn't get rid of that until 1999. We were the 49th state. So up until the time that I was 12 years old, my parents' marriage was not constitutional in this state. So when we as a group look at the federal government, and we can talk about some of the negatives, we've got to keep in mind the positives, because states have shown that without the federal government, there are times when they will not treat people fairly. Lastly, and I'll wrap up, two more things. I looked at this Freedom Index, the congressional scorecard, and I looked at this scorecard here, and it talked about the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which was passed by Congress, that established a framework to prohibit racial profiling at the federal, state, and local levels. And the group that created this gave everybody who voted in favor of that negative marks. And oddly enough, in this book, everybody who's a Democrat has a bad score, and everybody who's a Republican has a good score. And that gives me caution when I look at what people say about why we need to do an Article 5. Lastly, we had an opportunity in the House just yesterday to vote to make South Carolina government smaller with regards to the Second Amendment and the right to bear arms. And Representative Taylor, in line with his stances, voted in favor of allowing open carry on Capitol grounds. 70% of the sponsors of this bill seeking to rein in the federal government voted against reining in state government. And for those reasons, I'll be voting against this particular bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bamberg. Are there any other comments by members of the committee? Do note that, remember, the speaker told us because of inclement weather coming in today, he's closing the roll call in 2 minutes. So obviously, I'd love to hear from any members of the subcommittee, but this is part of the legislative process. So unless there are comments that there's a burning desire to have at this point in time, there'll be further discussion opportunity, assuming this passes at full committee. So with that, I'll ask staff please to call the roll.
Representative Newton.
Aye.
Representative Bamberg.
No.
No. Representative Fry.
Aye.
Representative Wheeler.
No.
No. Representative Murphy.
Aye.
Receives a favorable report.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. All business on the agenda having been addressed, we are adjourned.
Well, you've been watching a South Carolina House subcommittee hearing public testimony on the Convention of States Resolution H 3205, sponsored by Representative Bill Taylor, and it was quite exciting. There is a lot to discuss. We are planning to have Convention of States President and co-founder Mark Meckler joining us from the scene in just a few minutes. So hopefully he's getting ready right now. At least 60 Convention of States South Carolina supporters watched from an overflow room as this South Carolina House subcommittee heard testimony and then voted 3-2 to recommend passage of the Convention of States resolution in South Carolina. So this is a great moment for the citizens of South Carolina, the grassroots of Convention of States, and really for the whole country, because this resolution being considered in South Carolina and many other states right now holds what I am convinced is the last and best hope for truly restoring our federal system. Our lead sponsor, Representative Bill Taylor, made a great opening statement. He did keep it brief because time for testimony was limited to an hour. Apparently, there's really bad weather in South Carolina this morning, which I have to say just makes it even more amazing that we had at least 60 Convention of States supporters in South Carolina drive to the Capitol for this hearing. There's a picture of the overflow room that had to be opened for the COS supporters. And I have to mention, if you were watching the hearing, then you probably noticed there seemed to be a lot more opponent testimony than supporter testimony. And I think that is because the subcommittee, for whatever reason, took all of the testimony from the Zoom. So people who were watching and testifying remotely were given the opportunity to testify, while clearly not everyone who was actually there was given that opportunity. And we don't know why, we don't know the details surrounding that. And in any event, it doesn't ultimately matter because, again, the subcommittee just voted 3-2 to pass the Convention of States resolution onto the full House Judiciary Committee in the state of South Carolina. It's interesting, I'm informed that Representative Bill Taylor, our lead sponsor there in the South Carolina House, was actually the first legislator in the whole country to introduce the Convention of States resolution. So I'm sure he is pleased with this result today. As he said, Washington is broken. We're not going to have a runaway convention. He said that's silly, and it is silly. And he pointed out that we have a very real runaway Congress sitting in Washington, D.C. every day they're in session that we have to do something about. And this House Judiciary Subcommittee on Constitutional Law took a step in the right direction today to step up and use their constitutional authority under Article 5 to do something about the runaway Congress. We heard from Convention of States President and co-founder Mark Meckler, who held up his pocket constitution. I've got one here. Held up his pocket constitution, which is just a handful of pages that you can easily read in an hour or so, and pointed out that, yeah, the pocket constitution is great, but what's being followed today by the feds is not this pocket constitution that you and I read. It's a 3,000-page version of the Constitution that includes all of the Supreme Court. There's a picture of it. So see on top the pocket Constitution that the framers gave us. In that huge book that's extremely heavy, it's over 10 pounds, hard to carry. No one could read that even in a week, probably. That consists of all of the Supreme Court interpretations of the Constitution. That's the version of the Constitution that's being followed by the feds today, and that is a real problem. Now, as we continue to wait for President Mark Meckler, hopefully he is getting prepared to join us for live reaction on the ground and a short interview. I want to just make a few comments, particularly about the opposition testimony, because some of it is just completely outrageous. First of all, I want to point out that, oh, here we have Mark Meckler. Mark, thanks for joining us, and we all enjoyed listening to your testimony. Give us your first reaction.
I'm excited, of course, when it goes well in committee. And by the way, we're here with a bunch of grassroots activists in the room. That's just a small percentage of the people. Most of them headed over, having an event right after this. But it's exciting to see a committee do the right thing. I think it's really hard. I think when you're watching online, it's even harder. I know that from watching online. It's frustrating to listen to these people say that stuff. I was obviously sitting right next to everybody who was testifying. Particularly hard to sit there and just kind of keep your mouth shut. But I think it's important to remember that really they do themselves the most damage. And we do ourselves a favor by just kind of letting them go on. The committee was definitely, obviously, on our side. We knew that going in. Bill Taylor's done an incredible job of working this here in the legislature. The team in South Carolina, just a premier team. Remember, we've been doing this for 7 years here. So they know exactly what they're doing. They know exactly where the legislature is. They know how to say the right things and do the right things. Unlike what you see from the opposition, they don't insult the committee. They don't insult people who don't agree with them. So I was really proud of the grassroots, the way everybody behaved. I was proud of the legislators. Chairman came out and congratulated us afterwards. I couldn't have gone better, honestly.
Absolutely. We are all proud of that amazing South Carolina team. We mentioned just before the hearing that they actually won our Team of the Year award last year, and they certainly deserve that. Mark, can you tell us what happens next in the process there in South Carolina?
Yeah, so next it'll hopefully pretty rapidly go to the full committee. I think we look really good in the full committee. Our whip count is pretty good there. And then ultimately onto the floor. And the real question here, the important question, is crossover date. So crossover date is a technical date when things have to move from the House to the Senate in order to proceed. Senate to the House, either way. In this case, the House to the Senate. And so that's going to be the crunch, is just making sure we get this done. But last night, the speaker stopped by dinner. We had a dinner with a few legislators. He is fully in support. He's the #2 sponsor on this thing. That's a really big deal. That doesn't happen that often. So we have his support. I think we have a pretty good shot of getting out in the House and over to the Senate, and a good path in the Senate. I think it looks pretty good this year in South Carolina.
I think so too. I can't wait to see if South Carolina is going to be number 16 or one of our other states where legislation is pending. Mark, tell our viewers what they can do to get involved with this movement to restore meaningful limits on federal power.
Yeah, I think this is super important, Rita, which is people have to be involved. It's not enough to come to conventionofstates.com and sign the petition. I appreciate that. We love that. But the next step is there's a Take Action tab on the website. And what people need to do is click on that Take Action tab and volunteer. And I would say the most important thing you can volunteer to do is be a district captain. We now have district captains who are fully trained and active and involved in over 20% of state legislative districts in the nation. My goal is 50% by the end of this year. So that means you. If you're not involved now, go sign the petition. If you've already done that, go back to the website, click Take Action, get signed up, and actually be involved, because we can't save the country. Rita's doing a great job. Producer G's doing a great job, but we're not going to be able to save the country. You're the ones who are going to save the country.
Absolutely right. Mark, thank you so much for being there, for your great testimony today and everything you're doing. We know you are just tirelessly traveling around the country to give testimony and, to tell these legislators the truth and the real history of Article 5. And you're giving everyone hope for this meaningful solution to the crisis we have in our country today. So thank you for what you're doing.
Thanks. It's a real honor. Next week, we're off to Kansas and Wisconsin, so we'll see more great testimony and hopefully more victories.
We can't wait. Thank you.
Thanks.
And Producer G, I'm not sure if we have a reporter on the ground there. If not, I have plenty of fact checking that I can do before we close out this program. So I'll go ahead and just point out a few things. One of the common themes that we heard there from several of the opponents is they make this claim that amendments to the Constitution were never meant to have anything to do with correcting abuses of power. And so I'm just going to read one quote from James Madison. There are many that I could draw upon, but just one quote from a letter he wrote to Edward Everett in 1830, because it's so clear and concise. He said, "Should the provisions of the Constitution as here reviewed be found not to secure the government and rights of the states against usurpations and abuses on the part of the U.S., then the final resort within the purview of the Constitution lies in an amendment of the Constitution according to a process applicable by the states." That's not me, y'all. That's not someone from Convention of States telling you that. That's straight from the mouth of James Madison. So there you have it. And we know that historically, constitutional amendments have worked very well in achieving their desired aims. So it's important for everyone to take with a grain of salt what we see from these John Birch Society opponents. I also want to mention Evan Mulch there, another opponent, said, Well, the problem is congressmen don't obey the Constitution, so amending it's not going to help. Well, here's the thing. The congressmen are obeying that 10-pound, 3,000-page version of the Constitution that consists of all of the Supreme Court interpretations of the Constitution. There you're seeing on the screen the contrast between the pocket Constitution that the framers gave us and this huge monstrosity that our Supreme Court has given us. And I'll mention that the only way for we the people to overturn bad Supreme Court precedent is through the Article 5 process. That's the only way to do it. So it is high time for us to use this process. One more thing I want to mention, Producer G, we heard a couple of the opponents read from a report by an organization called the Congressional Research Service. So because that word congressional is in their name, people tend to think that this is some, official group that carries legal authority and legal weight, and what they say goes. Well, that's absolutely not correct. So these Congressional Research Service reports, all they're doing is collecting research from anyone and everyone who has ever said anything or contributed any idea to the questions they address. So you just can't take those Congressional Research Service reports that they're quoting. They carry no legal weight or authority at all. So I think those are the major fact checks that I wanted to do to just set the record straight. And it's about time for us to wrap up. Thank you for joining us today and watching this historic victory in the South Carolina House Subcommittee, which just voted 3-2 to recommend passage of the Convention of States resolution in the state of South Carolina. We, the people, are fed up with sending politicians to DC only to watch as they continue to expand the power of the federal government. And we know that Congress will never limit its own power. Our founding fathers, however, left us with a peaceful, constitutional method to rein in government overreach, and it's called an Article 5 Convention of the States. It just takes 34 state legislatures to pass matching resolutions to trigger this convention, and we've already passed it in 15 states. Joe Biden and his cronies in Congress can't do a thing to stop us. And right now, our legislation is active in 22 states now, and we're expecting critical action over the next several days in South Carolina and other states. But this is only going to happen if patriots like you do your part to make it happen. So go to conventionofstates.com, share the petition, and please join your Convention of States team. Help us make history and change DC